think we can all agree on the topic that people should feel comfortable enough to make their own choices about their body weight, regardless of the body image trend at the current moment. However, we cannot ignore that there is a healthy range of body weight that one has to stay in. The number on the scale, if it is too low or too high, can definitely negatively impact one's overall health and lead to the development of some chronic conditions. This is why today we're covering the most popular assessment for a healthy body weight, and that is the body mass index. And we're also going to talk about why it is deeply flawed and somewhat outdated, and how can you better use different measurements and define what a healthy body weight is for yourself. We're also going to talk about why some overweight people, according to the index, might be more metabolically healthy than somebody in the normal body weight range. All of the information in today's video is obtained from different scientific papers, and I will be linking all of them in the description box down below. Enough rambling. Let's get right into the video. We're going to start off with a brief history of how weight indexes came to be. The first idea of such a concept came to be in the 1900s, and there was this very big data set obtained from a very big insurance company in the US that was data of over 4 million adults, and scientists then used this data set to develop the so-called weight to height ratio and create these tables with the age, the height of the person, and then their desirable body weight. The first red flag is that this goal body weight was actually most of the time much lower than what the average body weight in the US at the time was. In the 1900s, the demographic did not look exactly the same way as it does today, so this already raises a few questions for the credibility of this weight to height ratio. The second red flag is that the taller people with the same weight to height ratio as shorter people did have a much lower mortality rate, so technically they were a lot healthier. And this was found out to be so because the mathematical equation did not account for taller people as being anything different than larger versions of shorter people, which is simply not the case, because taller people have longer limbs, and this leads to them having a different weight, different fat, different lean mass distribution, and the equation was not qualified to assess also those additional factors. This weight to height ratio would actually be pretty much cancelled a few years later in 1972 by the critical review of Keyes et al., which also led to the popularization of the body mass index as we know it today. The body mass index was actually not developed in 1972. It was first introduced by this Flemish astronomer and statistician. His name is Lambert Quetelet. I think he made a lot of great contributions to the statistics field. One of them was the development of the body mass index. He wanted to introduce a concept for the weight of the average man, and he figured out that by raising the height in meters to the second power, he could kind of cancel out the large effect of the height of a very tall person. This equation was then, I guess, forgotten about and reintroduced by Keyes et al. In 1972 as he was criticizing the weight to height ratio. And what Keyes et al. Essentially did in his critical review is obtain a data from a lot of research papers at the time and then use BMI to assess the health of the people in those studies. And at around the same time, the World Health Organization also introduced BMI as a way to assess one's body weight and health status. So that's how the body mass index gained its popularity that it has today. However, the original paper by Keyes et al. Has its very big limitations, and even the authors then emphasize that the body mass index is indeed flawed in the way that it cannot address a person's body fat percentage and therefore cannot make that correct assumptions about a person's health. It was never actually intended for medical use. The point of the body mass index was to be used in such large population studies like this with millions of people, where it is actually very complicated to obtain any different data, and it is good enough to make general assumptions about trends in the population. However, this is not how the body mass index was then incorporated. You know that it is even being studied at the university. We also studied it, although I don't remember us talking about the limitations of it that much. Just for your information, I'm going to put a graph of the body mass index classifications that we have today. They are still relevant, although the overweight is sometimes called overweight range, sometimes it's pre-obesity range, depending on where you source your information from. But the overweight range and the normal weight range are actually a very gray area, and you're going to find out why today. The first very big flaw of the Keys et al. Research paper is that the studies that they used to gather their weight and height data from were actually including only men. There were no women in these studies, so you're technically just excluding half of the population, but you know, this was not something that uncommon back in the day. People did not like to include women that much in research papers, and even the age groups of the men were very heterogeneous, so they were not all of the same age in all of the studies, which makes the statistical calculations of a lower quality. Men and women are not exactly the same when it comes to body fat, because men tend to accumulate most of their body fat in their central region, and women most of the time, of course this is not universal to each woman, tend to accumulate body fat in the lower region, so the thighs and the hips, which leads to women having a more favorable body fat distribution, at least before menopause. Because once women enter perimenopause and suffer these hormonal changes, then they also start accumulating more fat in the central region, and researchers suggest that this might be because of the influence of estrogen. Women also generally have a higher body fat percentage than men. This is completely universal. This is why you cannot put them all in the same category when we're talking about body fat percentages. The second big flaw of the Keys et al. Study is that it mostly included Caucasians, so white people, people of a European descent, and here and there were some other representatives of other ethnic and racial groups, but this was not very, again, strategically done, and they were just random people included in some of the studies, and there might be some differences in the different racial groups when we're talking about body fat distribution, lean mass distribution. There were some studies that compared the body mass index and also the body fat of non-Hispanic black individuals together with Asian individuals and white individuals, and then these papers found that for non-Hispanic black girls, although they had higher BMIs generally than the other two racial groups, they did not seem to differ in body fat, in adiposity, compared to the other two groups. So they had a higher body weight, possibly due to higher amounts of lean mass compared to the other two groups. Therefore, somebody that was with a higher BMI of an African American descent could actually be more metabolically healthy than somebody that has the lower BMI but also lower lean mass. This is again still a developing area of research. It is not exactly universal, but I think it is important to mention that we might not all be equal when talking about body fat distribution and lean mass distribution. There were some other studies done on Asian populations specifically that indicate that Asian populations that have a normal BMI might have more body fat compared to both white people and people of an African American descent, and this might make Asian populations more susceptible to specific health risks associated with a higher amount of body fat, specifically abdominal body fat, compared to the other two groups. So they would be less metabolically healthy than people with the same BMI that do not have that much body fat. It is important to mention, since we're on the topic of body fat and lean mass is much more metabolically active than fat mass. It leads to having a higher metabolism. It also helps with regulating your insulin levels. Fat mass is not really metabolically active. It serves as a reserve and also to protect, of course, our organs and everything, but in terms of our metabolism, it does not help a lot with that. This is also the reason why some people that might be classified as being overweight but have just a large amount of muscle mass could be much more metabolically healthy as somebody that is classified at a normal weight. Actually, if you go and calculate the body mass index for probably every gym bro out there that looks just buff and big, they're probably going to be classified into the overweight category. I did that for my boyfriend. You can just tell that he definitely goes to the gym and works out, but as you can see, he's being classified into the overweight category despite him looking perfectly healthy and just having more muscle mass probably than the average guy. And this is the big problem with the body mass index. It is not actually accurate for a large part of the male population that works out regularly and has more muscle mass. And even larger bodies of research have found that for men that all have the same body mass index, their body fat percentages tend to range drastically. There was this research paper where they ranged between 10 to 32%, which looks very different on a man. And the same goes for women. There were also some studies that included women and the body mass index. They all had a body mass index of 25, which is technically the cutoff point for overweight. And there were women that ranged there between 26% body fat, which looks very different than the highest body fat percentage in the paper, which was 43% body fat. Since I mentioned abdominal adiposity a lot, having large amounts of abdominal body fat, it is also called visceral fat, has been linked time and time again to a higher risk of developing of cardiovascular disease and also cardiovascular disease mortality. Having a lot of body fat stored in that region also leads generally to a higher grade of inflammation. This is the fat that is technically around your organs. And the other fat that is being distributed in your legs and hips, most of the time women have more of that body fat, is actually not going to impact your health in the same way. There are different ways to assess one's body fat and its distribution, but a lot of them are going to require different apparatuses and different procedures that are definitely a lot more complicated than just weighing yourself on the scale and measuring your height. Some of them include a DEXA scan. You might have seen this in some YouTube videos. There you can also assess the amount of the body fat in your body. Some of them also include underwater weighing, which assesses your body's density, and then the fat percentage can be calculated. Other techniques include the bioimpedance analysis, which is something that I have tried as well, but like in a non-clinical setting, just at my gym. But it is actually largely flawed in settings like this because, of course, it is not being regularly calibrated, so I stopped analyzing myself with that. I figured that if I want to get the correct measurement, it would be much better to go to an actual office and not do it in my gym where people were using it multiple times a day. So all of these things might be more difficult to incorporate for very large populations, and it would also be costly for the individual to go and do a scan like this. What people can do today is measure their so-called waist to hip ratio. This is something that has been studied a lot in recent research papers as somewhat of a replacement of the body mass index, or incorporated together with the body mass index in order to assess if an individual is indeed not metabolically healthy, or even individual is indeed obese or overweight. The thing with the waist to hip ratio is that you measure your tiniest point in your waist and then you measure your hips, and then there are these tables where you can assess whether you have a higher grade of abdominal adiposity or not. There is actually no overweight category with the waist to hip ratio. According to the World Health Organization, there is only an obese category. At the same time, the waist to hip ratio for a person with one BMI that is very highly physically active is probably going to be much lower than for the same person with the same BMI that is not highly physically active, just because of the body mass distributions. One research paper included even over 300,000 adults that were from different ethnic groups to compare body mass index and then its incorporation together with the waist to hip ratio and waist circumference. This is kind of similar to the waist to hip ratio, but it does not include the hips, it just includes the waist. And it found that the waist to hip ratio was significantly better at assessing the risk of hypertension, cardiovascular disease, and all of that compared to the body mass index. This is why it has been recommended to be an accurate replacement of the two. Additionally, in another observational study, it was again confirmed that even if your body mass index was in the normal range, if you had a significantly increased waist to hip ratio, the mortality risk risks was also significantly increased because of the higher amounts of abdominal fat. One thing that I'm interested in is how does this apply to people with a wider rib cage and wider waist, because I am a person like this and I have not measured my waist to hip ratio, but I know it's not going to be as small as I would like it to be. To conclude with a newer report that came out last year, it stated that BMI should not be used as the only criteria when making decisions regarding one's health. And apart from the waist to hip ratio and all of that I discussed until now, they also include the need to incorporate other biochemical markers such as one's lipid profile, glucose levels, insulin levels, and also inflammatory markers to gain more information about one's metabolic health status and have a better understanding of what's going on inside one's body. The BMI, however, is not being cancelled completely, but it is to be used for screening and for the creation of larger population studies with hundreds of thousands of people where obtaining all of this other information is not possible. And last point, because of the current trends, the researchers never discussed, never debated the accuracy of the body mass index for one being underweight, which indicates to me that it is probably accurate for that population group. And that has, of course, its own negative implications for your health. And fitting into the trendiest aesthetic right now actually would probably classify you in the ranges of being underweight, which if you go into the studies about the mortality rates, you would see that the mortality rates also increase as the BMI decreases rapidly. And this is definitely something to consider if you want to keep an eye on your long-term health. Thank you so much for being here with me today. I hope that you enjoyed the contents of today's video. Let me know down in the comments below if you have a topic that you would like me discuss in the next one. Also, I'm not sure when the next video will be coming out because I'm going to be away for a very little bit, so I might skip a week or two, but we're going to see about that. Thank you again very much for watching, and I will see you in the next one.